Across the country, empty streets and empty office towers don't just mean a change in how we work. Entire communities have relocated to new places. A corporate headquarters can put tens of billions into local economies. In Charlotte, Bank of America has 180,000 employees working from home during the pandemic. Austin-based Dell expects more than half of their 160,000 staffers to never go back to their desks.
Here in the San Francisco Bay Area, Google and Facebook have announced that most of their workers will be at home for the rest of the year. But Twitter has announced that its workers will be at home from now on. And that's going to have an enormous impact, far beyond just empty desks in a building like this.
Nail salons, barbers, shoe repair, dog groomers, optometrists, bars. The list is long of those who depend on a workaday crowd. And they all stand to suffer if their customers don't commute in. Dan Miller's chain of dry cleaners has stores in walking distance of many tech companies.
We've seen declines nationwide of between 70 and 75% in the dry cleaning and laundry business. It's, I would say, one of the hardest hit industries other than probably airlines and hotels. But it's going to be a new world, right?
And for the folks who made a living selling to the lunch crowd, Twitter's announcement means the pain of the pandemic could be permanent.
Our sales are about 40% lower. Being able to service more of our community is going to be more of our focal point instead of just looking towards upstairs within our building.
Are there any upsides? Well, a post-pandemic office might give each person a lot more room. Matt Mullenweg's 1,200-person company has worked from home for years, and he says it's pretty great.
We don't realize how much time and agency we trade off in an office environment. At home, everyone has a corner office. You're like the CEO of your own home.
So when this is all over, will we ever come back to an office again?
My prediction from having done a lot of research on this is, for those of us that can work from home, which is roughly 40% of people, I don't think many people are going to do that full time. I think the much more standard thing would be something like 2 or 3 days a week at home.
And that might change the places we wind up living.
And because you can come in and work in the office only 2 days a week, it's much easier for people to live, say, 2 hours out of the city because they're only commuting twice a week.
Mullenweg says he's already seen that happen.
Do they disperse when you give them the freedom to work from home? Have people scattered?
Typically within that first year, people will look for a little more bang for their buck. If you're not having to commute every day, moving 20 or 30 minutes out, you can get some incredible space, more land, more air, better schools, like any number of things that might be a priority for you at the same or less cost.
Working from home now is a chance to stay safe while we wait for a vaccine. But city life may never be the same again.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.